Hello everyone, and welcome on behalf of the European Parliament to this round table that we have, or panel discussion rather, that we have organized on the topic of Brexit and the voluntary third sector. My name is Per Johansson. I am the head of office of the European Parliament office in Edinburgh. The European Parliament has offices all around Europe, in all the 28 member states of the EU. But in some of the bigger countries, we also have offices in parts of the member states. So in the UK, we have one main office in London and one smaller office here in Edinburgh, or not here in Edinburgh, but in Scotland and in Edinburgh. And what do? We try to, by doing events and by informing the Scottish public about what the European Parliament does, we try to raise awareness around the issues that affect Scotland and that are discussed in the European Parliament. And we also try to reach out to all kinds of organizations, both public, private, civil society, in and around Scotland, in order to engage with the European Parliament, both with the members of the European Parliament and with the European Parliament as an institution. It's important to say that today's event will also be web streamed. So we're also, of course, welcoming all our viewers online, and we hope that you will enjoy the event as well as all of you that are here today. If you want to get involved online, and if you want to get involved on Twitter, there's a hashtag called EP on Brexit that you can use if you want to tweet about the event or get involved in the debate. There's also quite a lot of information about the European Parliament and Brexit on our website, which you can see all the details of and the contact details on this banner here or in the materials that you've been given, and on the EP Think Tank website, where there's a lot of studies around this topic and many other interesting topics. I should also say that the European Parliament, of course, has a very important role in the Brexit negotiations, because the European Parliament has a vote whether the withdrawal agreement is accepted or not. So at the end of the process, the European Parliament has to have a vote. And the other thing to say is the European Parliament is also involved in the process by talking to the other institutions, so the European Commission, the Council, but also by publishing resolutions. And there is a new resolution being worked on at the moment in the European Parliament, which will, if everything goes to plan, be published at the next plenary session of the European Parliament in March, in mid-March, basically. So keep a lookout for that as well, and you will see the views of the European Parliament on these things. Before I hand you over to our eminent panel, I just wanted to plug two other events that you might be interested in. On the 2nd of March, we are going to organize, together with Catherine Styler, MEP, and other politicians, female politicians of the European Parliament, International Women's Day event in Edinburgh. If you check our website, you will find all the details, but just remember the date, 2nd of March in Edinburgh, International Women's Day event about women in politics, and especially Scottish MEPs who are women and who were MEPs as well, old MEPs. And we're also, together with the European Commission, going to organize a bigger event here in Glasgow on the 9th of May. It'll be a Europe Day event, probably at George Square, but I'm looking at Graham now. George Square on the 9th of May? Yeah, George Square on the 9th of May. So if you want to come out and see a little bit about celebration of Europe and of the member states and their delicacies, both when it comes to culture and possibly some food and drink as well, we'll see, then you're much welcome on the 9th of May. But please have a look at our website on our upcoming event section, and you'll see what we've got planned. But without further ado, I will now hand you over to Charles, your moderator for today.
Per, thank you very much indeed, and welcome to the centre of Glasgow and at the heart of Scotland, and talking about Brexit and having the impact of Brexit on the voluntary sector across Scotland. eminent panel who are joining us today, Una Aitken, Nicole Busby, and Anthony Salmon. We've spoken amongst ourselves that we're not going to spend an awful lot of time in our biogs, but we can tell you that, of course, Una began her career in teaching before becoming engaged in various management roles. She spent a couple of years in Brussels as part of her role as European Liaison Officer at Strathclyde Regional Council, and has some solid and useful views on Brexit and the voluntary sector across the European Union. Nicole has been a Professor of Law and is a Professor of Law at Strathclyde University, and is also a member of the Scottish Government's Employment Tribunal Stakeholders Forum, and that is going to be informing policy on the devolution of employment tribunals and also taking a look at the abolition of fees. And Anthony Salomon is the Managing Editor of European Futures, the joint Edinburgh Europa Institute blog on Europe, and you're also the incoming co-editor of the Journal of Contemporary European Research. Would you please welcome them all? And it's a very warm welcome to you watching us online, wherever you happen to be. We are streaming this live from Glasgow. You'll also be able to replay this again on Facebook and YouTube, courtesy of our friends at Glowcast. A very warm welcome to you. And as Per said, you can be involved in the action by using hashtags EP on Brexit or hashtag SCVO gathering. And also we're on Twitter with @EP_Edinburgh. And if you want to troll me or send something nice, my Twitter account is @FletcherCharles. Well, it's 600 days, if you can believe it, since the EU referendum, and it's 400 days, if we're to believe what we're told, that we will be leaving the European Union. Today, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has, well, depending who you're listening to, has a meeting of her Brexit cabinet or war cabinet at Chequers. That's happening this afternoon into this evening. I'm led to believe from a former minister that once there is an announcement to coincide with the news at 10 on whatever channel you choose, the quote is, if everybody is happy, it's a fudge, and if anything is decided, someone will be unhappy. Thank you so much. This is live. The transition period has been proposed to kick in on departure. That has been a conversation piece this week and will no doubt be on the table at Chequers as well. The duration and the style of that departure period of the transition is uncertain. And that comes at a time when the voluntary sector is very much needing and seeking to have some certainty. This morning, Scotland's Brexit Minister, Mike Russell, said that there was indeed some movement in the conversations between the UK government and the devolved administrations on the EU withdrawal bill. He says that they generally, in the past, have come to the table, said nothing, they go away to do nothing, and then they start it all over again. Well, as Theresa May sometimes says, nothing changes. Well, everything changes every day. And before we just came into this room, David Lidington said that talks have this day taken a considerable step forward in negotiations between the UK government and the devolved administrations. Quite how that will pan out with the conversations at Chequers, we shall find out later this evening. In the meantime, we invite you to take part in this here in the room. Very keen to have your questions. Questions will be delighted to have on microphone, otherwise they won't be recorded. The way to say something is if you could perhaps just catch my eye, just a little movement like that. If you have an apple nearby you care to throw, please do that. We'll try to catch it. Otherwise, we shall get round as many questions and have some answers from the panel as best we can. And online, don't forget, we'll be monitoring what you're saying as well, and delighted to hear from you wherever you are. And so, let's begin. Una, would you care to welcome us here? Good to see you.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Charles, and thanks very much to the European Parliament here in Scotland for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. My own organisation, Volunteering Matters, is a UK-wide charity that basically exists to organise volunteering opportunities for people of all ages and abilities across the country. We have a vision of a society where everyone can participate in their community, and of course we would like that participation to take the form of volunteering and social action. We believe that through the power of volunteering, individuals, groups and communities can demonstrate their active citizenship and can transform the lives of the people they volunteer for and with, and transform their own lives as well. As well as being Chief Executive of Volunteering Matters, I am also President of Volunteerope, a European and international network of organisations which involve volunteers, and we're about 65 members strong at the moment. Our network, Volunteerope, stands for Active Citizenship, Social Justice and Volunteering, and I'll return to our activities a bit later. I can really only speak in my personal capacity and not for the voluntary sector in the UK generally, but I do fully endorse the stance that SCVO and the other devolved countries' representative bodies have taken on Brexit and the damage that it's going to cause to our sector, not just in terms of potential loss of funding, but the loss of a strong voice in Europe. As you can see from my bio and what Charles has said, I've got strong ties to Europe, having worked there in the 1990s, but also having promoted European partnerships and joint working, both in local government and in the voluntary sector. The UK voluntary sector is incredibly well regarded in Europe, for the kinds of reasons that John Downey, who's in the audience today, highlighted in his recent blog. They believe rightly that we do governance well, that we are open, honest and transparent and accountable, that we evidence what we do and we show the impact of our work. The Guardian has published the extent of what it thinks will be lost in terms of funding, and I'll say a word or two about that in terms of our own experience. Like many voluntary organisations, we do a lot of work with young people. Not enough here in Scotland, but I hope that's going to be changing in the future. If no agreement is found with the EU, we will lose our ability to be part of the Europe for Citizens programme and Erasmus+, just to name two. I think lots of people think that Erasmus is just about university students having the opportunity to study in another country, but as I'm sure you know, it is about much, much more than that. Volunteering Matters and Volunteerope have been part of the programme for many years, and we've used it to support young people's volunteering. Across the EU. Just in the last few years, we've been focusing on young people with fewer opportunities, those who do not typically volunteer, and those who do not typically have the opportunity to volunteer in another European country. I felt that we were just at the beginning of a really big breakthrough. We've not only been supported by the EU, but also by the Allianz Kulturstiftung in Germany, who want to continue to support that programme. This year, ironically, we've been funded to develop and implement a major programme of strategic European voluntary service, which will allow many young Europeans to volunteer across the UK in a variety of settings. This kind of free movement and exchange is what enriches a country, in the same way, I believe, as free movement of citizens does. One of the fundamental rights of being part of a European Union that's about equality, solidarity and social justice for all. Volunteering Matters and Volunteerope participate in a number of European networks. Solidar, the Social Justice and Social Rights Network, of which I'm the treasurer, the European Civic Forum and Civil Society Europe, and I'm on the boards of both of these, the European Social Platform, the European Lifelong Learning Platform. I know that many of you will know these networks and know the work that they do and their values. At a time when the values upon which the European Union was founded are being eroded, when voluntary organisations in some countries are being shut down or deprived of funding, when civic space and freedom of association is being limited, civil society needs an even stronger voice in Europe. And the UK voluntary sector needs to be part of that strong voice. Speaking out for what we believe in, the power of voluntary action, the power of giving your time and energy to help the most vulnerable in our society and communities, however you choose to do it. I'm personally concerned that when and if we leave the EU, we'll struggle to be part of that strong voice. And although I'm doing my best to ensure that Voluntary Europe and volunteering matters remain part of this work, even post-Brexit, and I know that SCVO are also showing strong leadership in this area. So although funding is important, and we will join with SCVO and other representative bodies to urge the Scottish Government and the UK Government to speak out and negotiate our continued involvement in the funding programmes, we'll also look to the sector to continue to support civil society in Europe. The importance of all this was brought home to me on Monday evening in Brussels. We organised an evening session to launch our report, Active Citizens for the Common Good, the Active Citizenship Footprint, and you can download the report from our website. We had a packed event in Brussels and 3 brilliant speakers, and I just want to talk very, very briefly about the most powerful of these, Marta Lempart, whom you may have heard of. She was the part of the Polish women's strike. She's an incredibly brave woman who has been at the forefront of the women and some men's protest against the Polish government's attempt to ban legal abortion in Poland. The protests have continued as the government there has attempted to make far-reaching restrictive changes to the law. We need to support our colleagues in civil society in those countries where freedom to operate and to be a force for the common good is threatened. I hope that we won't find that increasingly difficult post-Brexit. Marta was awarded one of the Active Citizens in Europe Awards last year, which we organised jointly with the European Civic Forum. SCVO has just joined the forum in its own right, as has ENA, the European Network of National Platforms, which SCVO chairs. The Europe we want is, I believe, about protecting human rights. We almost don't know what we're going to lose in our sector and in other sectors in terms of employment protection, environmental issues, and I could go on. The voluntary sector in the UK, I believe, has to continue to be about, despite the recent issues, protecting fundamental rights, working for the voice of the most vulnerable in our society, promoting an asset-based approach to community and personal development, social justice and equality. I believe we will be poor in all of those areas when we leave the EU. But, excuse me, it's the political and economic union that we might be leaving. We're not necessarily leaving European civil society or the European voluntary sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Key point, we'll come back to the Active Citizens for the Common Good and get some further details on where we can get that online. Thank you, Una, thank you very much. Nicole, may I invite you?
Thank you. And thanks as well for the invitation from the European Parliament to speak at this important event. Interesting hearing Una speak there from the kind of front line, if you like, of service provision in the areas with which most of you are also actively engaged. My perspective is, of course, slightly different as an academic and a lawyer who specialises in European law, in employment law and in equality law. I'm one of the founding members of a network, an academic network in Scotland called the Scottish University Legal Network on Europe. Now, we formed that very shortly after the Brexit referendum result, as kind of, I suppose, a kind of support group, really, because we thought, what are we all going to do now, and how are we going to manage all the stuff that we now have to absorb and then communicate to our students and beyond. So it's been very, very helpful in that way. But out of that sort of coalition, if you like, of different individuals and different universities, a very focused project has emerged. And I want to speak a little bit about that project and some of the elementary findings, and then I want to really invite all of you to get involved with that project if you think it would be helpful to you. So the project is called Civil Society and Brexit. And it is, as I say, it's a partnership between SOLNI, the Scottish Universities Legal Network on Europe, and the Scottish Human Rights Consortium, and it's been generously funded for 2 years by the Legal Education Foundation. So it's a Scottish focus project, and what we're interested in doing on that project, two main aims really. We want to first of all gain an insight into the independent advice sector, so the civil society sector, around what sorts of issues organisations are concerned about. So we really wanted to gather information on that, share that information, provide networking opportunities, and we also wanted to help organisations to prepare for Brexit, whatever that means. And, you know, I'm sure if any of you do have the answer to what Brexit means, you know, maybe you could enlighten us when we ask for questions and comments shortly. So we are offering assistance, really. We're offering assistance largely in areas where legal expertise may be needed for organisations who are grappling and struggling with the whole sort of Brexit, as I say, scenario, whatever that might be. I'll come back to how you can get in contact with us at the end, and I've also, if anyone is interested, I've got some information that I can give you to take away with you. But what have we done? Well, so far we've only really been, the project got started in the autumn last year. We've had a few events, we've got more to come. Some of you may have been represented or may have attended those events. We invited third sector organisations to come to events. We gave short presentations about the likely impacts of Brexit for organisations in the sector, and then we had roundtable discussions with organisations to gather information. So we've spoken to quite a few third sector civil society organisations already, and what we're finding, and none of this I'm sure will surprise those of you active in the sector, the more easy to identify threats, if you like, by Brexit or from Brexit, are the social economic effects. Because that obviously is the area, if we look at legal competence of the EU, that's where the big impact has been felt in member states. So things like employment rights, Una mentioned, equality rights in particular has come up at every event we've had. Employment and equality rights we might think are very well enshrined in domestic legislation. Politicians will sometimes tell us that. I have fears about that and the stability of that, particularly where we're looking at rights which are implemented through regulation in the UK or in Scotland or in Great Britain, because the equality rights, of course, exclude Northern Ireland and are just GB focused. So I've got worries about that around things like working time regulation, some of the rights to do with non-standard working protections, so part-time workers regulations, temporary workers regulations, and some maternity and paternity protections as well are also regulated or governed, implemented in the UK context in regulations. Now they're vulnerable because of the way that the EU withdrawal bill is dealing with you know, matters going forward, if you like. I won't get into the sort of technicalities of that. So that's a worry in itself. Equality rights, people say, well, we've got the Equality Act 2010. Everyone says it's pretty good at transposing the EU governance, EU regulation into domestic law, and it is pretty good. There have been some issues which have required tidying up, but of course, once we leave the EU, that legislation can be amended, can be repealed, and can be changed, got rid of, post-Brexit Day. So there are no guarantees post-Brexit Day in terms of what we know so far about what's going to happen. So there are worries there as well. And civil society organisations have been telling us that they're worried about these rights as employers and as service providers, because obviously that's going to mean that they have obligations which will be uncertain towards those that they employ, but also they're going to have to deal with a lot of the fallout from this. And the uncertainty is posing lots of challenges, I think, for organisations operating in the sector. So there are lots of fears around that. You know, it's difficult to offer any guarantees because we simply don't know what's going to happen. But the project aim, certainly, is to help, as things unfold, to help with progress and to help with advice and support that might be needed. There are other issues, of course, aside from the social economic consequences. So even areas which are not particularly or directly affected by EU legislation, and Una has spoken about some of those. So there are threats, of course, to things like funding for organisations. And in some of the wider sorts of policy areas, there will also be threats and worries, fears about Brexit, which have been voiced to us by civil society organisations. So social funds, for example, and access to those funds for communities and organisations, and the knock-on effect on things like poverty in Scotland, I think is a great concern. NGOs which operate across Europe are fearful for their future and what Brexit might mean for them. And then there's the impact, we've heard about the impact on the Erasmus scheme and other schemes like that. There's also the impact on the research base, particularly university funding for research. So where civil society organisations seek to gather data, for example, and go to universities for that kind of work, there are worries and concerns about funding for that going forward, where the funding is EU derived. So lots of worries that we've been hearing about. And as I say, because of the uncertainty, it's very difficult to give any assurances or guarantees on any of that. But they are very discernible from our engagement with the sector so far. There aren't any easy solutions. There is still some opportunity to influence what's happening in the UK context through the bill that's going through Parliament currently in Westminster, the EU withdrawal bill. And I'll give you information about how you might, if you're not involved in lobbying or influencing, how you might be able to do that. And then the Scottish Parliament are talking about a continuity bill if it looks like no deal is going to be struck. I think, again, there's confusion and fear about what that might mean for Scotland. And if that does happen, there will be opportunities to influence that process as well. So you can get involved, you can be engaged, and I'm sure that you are. But I think the lack of information is the main concern that we're hearing about. And so I'm just going to finish by saying, do come and speak to me today if you want information about our project and you think it might be useful to you. I've got some stuff that you can take away. Or go to the Human Rights Consortium Scotland's website for updates and to engage in the project. There's a Brexit tab on the website, and if you go press on that tab, you'll see that there is information which gives insights and independent advice for the civil society sector. And there's also a way that you can submit, if you've got a question you want to ask us or some work you think that we could help you with, there is an opportunity, there's a box there, you can fill that in and send it in through the website, and we will respond to you. So it's a call really for engagement with us, and please do use the opportunity. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much indeed. And we will take the opportunity to speak with you later to get some further information, contact details, and how we can participate in the EU withdrawal bill, how we can have some exert some influence and engagement there, and also at Holyrood. Thank you very much. We turn now to Anthony Salamone, and welcome to this afternoon's panel. Please.
Slide it this way. Okay. Perfect. Thanks very much, Charles. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thanks to the European Parliament Office and to Per and team for inviting me. I should just say before I get underway with what I wanted to convey to you that I'm not here with an academic hat per se, rather as a think tanker from the Scottish Centre on European Relations, where I'm Research Fellow and Strategic Advisor, where I work with my colleague Dr. Kirsty Hughes. We are Scotland's independent EU think tank, so I'll be speaking from that point of view and trying to offer a general politics perspective, sort of top-level politics perspective, and where I think Brexit is at the moment, very, very briefly, obviously, as we could talk about it for quite a long time. And then two issues which I think were presumably quite salient for you, which is what I think the sort of the state of Brexit will mean for free movement of people after Brexit, and as I said, just tangentially on the impact on participation in EU programs after Brexit. So first off, in terms of where we are at the moment in terms of Brexit, I think it's quite clear that The current course towards a hard Brexit, and by that I mean leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, remains. Theresa May has always been clear about that since her Lancaster House speech, and despite everything that's happened since, including the snap general election last year, that has not changed. In terms of the UK's participation in other kinds of programs, other EU programs it's a part of now as a member state, I think that's questionable. I mean, as to which ones the UK will be part of. I'm sure there will be some where it might be feasible to do so, but I imagine for the majority of them, the UK might decide not to do that. So how will we conceive what the sort of future relationship between the UK and the EU will be after Brexit? Well, I presume besides the trade arrangements, there'll be some sort of strategic partnership which encompasses the other areas of cooperation that Theresa May and her cabinet colleagues talk about, from security to sort of culture and exchange and education and so on. And the work on that I don't think is really going to begin for some time, because the preoccupation at the moment is trying to secure the withdrawal agreement and also the transition. As we know, I mean, time is running out. There won't be time to go into any great detail on what the future relationship will look like before autumn of 2018, when the deal is supposed to be ready in time for it to be ratified, including approved by the European Parliament in an up or down vote. So that sort of real sort of lower level policy detail, I don't think it's going to come out until after Brexit has already happened and we're in the transition period. So yes. So in terms of the direction more generally, in terms of trade, it's clear that we are headed towards a Canada-style free trade agreement, because the EU has made it quite clear, Michel Barnier and colleagues, that in the absence of the UK wanting to be part of the single market, which would be a sort of an EFTA or Norway-style arrangement, there is only a Canada arrangement. There is no sort of magic, bespoke, special, unique deal available, and that will obviously have implications for the areas that I mentioned I want to talk about. So in terms of the transition period, the EU has been quite clear in its guidelines. And I should just say as well that in terms of if you wanted to have an EU perspective on how the talks are going, Danuta Hübner, MEP, she's the chair of the European Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee. She's recently written a piece for us on how she thinks the negotiations are going. She's part of the Parliament's Brexit sort of steering establishment. That's on our website, which is scr.scot, and it's quite short, but it gives you an interesting perspective on how the EU27 see the talks progressing. But on the question, coming back to now of transition, the EU has made quite clear in all of its guidelines that the transition should be a standstill period. So that means that the UK will be part of most of the sort of structures of the European Union, except have no say in them. And we always knew that would be at political level, so there would be no, so this is from after March of 2019 until when the transition period ends, which is currently set around December of 2020 or so, something like that. We always knew that there'd be no British members of the European Parliament at that date, there'd be no UK commissioner, but the EU, I think, has made more clear that there'll be not only will there be no political representation of the UK, there'll be no institutional representation either on a sort of practical level. So for instance, one of the points that's come out is that the UK is actually quite popular to sort of certify cars for sale in the single market. I mean, the EU perspective at the moment is that the UK will lose the right to do that from Brexit, not after the transition from the date of Brexit, which I don't think has really sunk in for a lot of people. Free movement is presumably meant to continue during the transition. Obviously, this is one of the sticking points in that the UK government is trying to argue that from March 2019 there should be a slightly different arrangement for new EU citizens arriving into the UK. The EU has been very clear that that is not its own position. That free movement should continue as it is up until the end of the transition, and indeed that the European Court of Justice should have some sort of role in terms of the withdrawal agreement, both for transition but also for residual rights for EU nationals and so on. I think it's quite likely that in the end of the day the UK government will cave in on those demands, as it has for almost every other demand which is originally made in the negotiations up to date and with respect to the withdrawal agreement. I just want to touch very briefly before moving on to those other questions I mentioned about the possibility of extending the transition. And I saw that was in the news yesterday and today, particularly in the FT, saying that we could have a 5-year transition or so on. I think that's very unlikely. I think that's unlikely for two reasons on the EU side. I mean, so much of the debate here on Brexit always focuses on what is in the interests of the UK and what do we think might be important or good for us. And, do we want to have a short transition or a long transition? But obviously, the length of the transition is also up to the European Union as well on the other side. And the EU, as far as I can see anyway, is not interested in a long transition, is not interested in an open-ended or indefinite transition. The EU perspective is that the sort of around 2 years works for us. Two reasons for this, as I said. One is legal. From my understanding, in terms of the EU negotiating team, Task Force 50, as it's called in the Commission, they're basing everything for their Brexit program and works and negotiations on Article 50. And the interpretation from them has been that Article 50 requires or will only permit a relatively short transition of around perhaps 2 to 3 years. Anything longer than that, it doesn't look like a transition anymore. It starts to look like a trade agreement, and we need to go through the Article 218 trade process. So that's a legal reason, but a political reason. I think in general, the EU 27 want to find a final agreement with the UK and want to conclude it and move on. And that implies that we can't have a transition going on forever. The end of 2020 works quite well because it comes towards the end of the EU budget timeframe, and then the EU can start afresh with a new multi-annual financial framework for the 7 years afterwards without the UK. I'm sure it's probably possible to have an extension of a couple of weeks or months if it looks like a deal is really close, but I think that's where we are. Now, in terms of the other two issues I mentioned, keeping in mind that a hard Brexit is the course we're on at the moment. One is EU programs and funding, such as Erasmus Plus or whatever the successor to Horizon 2020 is meant to be. Can't quite remember the next name. Could the UK be part of such programs outside the EU? Well, I think that's certainly possible. Obviously, the UK would have to agree to pay for them, and the EU would have to want the UK to be part of them. But we have examples of other countries that are not part of the European Union or part of programs like Erasmus Plus, and it's certainly feasible. But I want to just go through what I think are some factors at play which make the situation more difficult in that respect. One is that the UK government is very preoccupied with what we call the high politics of Brexit at the moment, and you could see this from the news. The focus so much when we talk about Brexit is on trade, and we know that there are so many other issues which are equally important, but in any case, the focus is on trade, it's on security, it's on migration, or indeed the sort of internal politics of the UK government or the Conservative Party or looking at the opposition Labour Party and so on and so forth. That's sort of the other issues, sort of more detailed issues on education and culture and exchange, I think are at least second order, if not third order priorities for the UK government at a top level. That may change as we get into the more detail of the future relationship, but obviously, I presume that you would be trying to push, or some of your organizations that are more campaigning would try to push to bring those issues up the agenda, and I'm sure there'll hopefully be an opportunity to do that. Second, I think it's unclear, certainly at the moment, which programs or which aspects of programs the UK government might want to be part in. When we talk about Erasmus, and Una mentioned it before, that there's so much more to Erasmus Plus than just university exchanges, but that is what is most salient in public mind. Perhaps a UK government, either the current one or a future one, would want to sort of try to either be in Erasmus or replicate a sort of university exchange because that's what is salient in public mind, but the other areas are not as much of a priority for it. I can't say, I don't know, but I'm saying that might be possible. And the third question, I think, is it's questionable of how long-term or sustainable those choices might be, even if the UK does sign up to Erasmus Plus after Brexit. Presumably that wouldn't be forever. That would have to be something that would be renewed, with each 7-year budget, each multi-annual financial framework. I think that would be logical, both for the UK and the EU. If there's a change of heart or as the programs evolve, one or the other party might not want to be part of it anymore. That it certainly injects a degree of uncertainty. Obviously, 7 years is a fair amount of time, but still, each time each cycle comes along, would the UK still be part of these initiatives, or would one of those sort of cycles be an opportunity that's taken to break with them? I think that's possible. Just to touch on, because obviously here in Scotland, there's always a question of what Scotland's arrangements could be, and could Scotland have a different situation in terms of Erasmus Plus or whatever else if the UK didn't want to be part of it, for example, say, in a hypothetical situation. I think that's something which is certainly possible to explore, but obviously that require the agreement of both the UK government and the EU 27, and it would be difficult. Another area, of course, to highlight in that respect is that would the Scottish government be able and willing to pay for that access itself? Of course, an argument could be made that the UK government should pay for it, but if it came down to it and the UK said, no, we're not going to pay for it, the Scottish government, if you want to sign up to it, and we'll allow you to do that, but you need to pay for it yourself, how would that work or not? And finally, just to touch on free movement of people after Brexit. Following on from what I've said once about the course of a hard Brexit, leaving the single market, and obviously that presumes that there'll be no freedom of movement free movement of people as we consider it being part of the EU after the transition period. That necessitates there be some degree of barriers to migration in both directions, of course, from UK citizens into the EU 27 and EU 27 citizens into the UK. So much of the political debate here focuses on inward EU migration, EU citizens coming into the UK, and of course that's important and essential, but obviously a change in the migration system will equally impact the opportunities of UK citizens to move into the EU 27, and presumably, particularly for your organizations which are based on visiting other member states and voluntary other capacities, you'll know that. I think the UK government, it remains to be seen, of course, what kind of migration system or policy is designed in the end after Brexit. It could be one where things are largely as they are in terms of the ability of being able to access the UK for EU27 citizens. It's just not within the formal structures of the single market or sort of the acquis. We've sort of, the UK will leave the EU, leave the structures, but sort of replicate a lot of the policy. That's possible. Equally possible that once the symbolism of leaving the EU, once the symbolism of Brexit is achieved, a more sensible approach might envelop Westminster and Whitehall. The final point I'd wanted to conclude on, or actually the penultimate point I wanted to think about, is that is this other end. As I say, this discussion is what the UK government's immigration policy would be. But we have to think, on the other hand, what would the EU's response be? And if the UK decides to be out of the single market, even if it has a liberal independent migration policy, I don't think that necessarily means that the EU will reciprocate on a very equivalent basis. If you want to be in the single market and have free movement of people, then we allow that. But if you restrict migration for the EU would say, our citizens into the UK, then we will restrict your migration into ours. And if it's not going to be a quid pro quo. It's either you're in the single market or you're not. In a worst case scenario, which I'm not saying this will happen, but it could, we could see UK citizens entering the EU or Schengen having to apply for visa waivers, the new ETIAS system, which the EU is bringing in, comparable to the US ESTA visa waiver system. That would be catastrophic because of the presumably hundreds of thousands of millions of journeys that people make between the UK and the Schengen area. So there's a lot there, which is, as Nicole mentioned, difficult to see where it's going. But obviously it's issues which merit a great deal more discussion on perhaps more detail than they often do in public debate. And just to touch on finally on proposals which have been sort of circulated recently on the idea of Scotland having an independent immigration policy after Brexit. Obviously that's sort of UK politics rather than EU politics. I think it's quite clear that in the current political context at UK level that's not something which is very likely, though it is feasible. There are other countries which have regional migration policies. And I think that's where we are in terms of the future of migration into EU access after Brexit. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Enriching from all on the panel, thank you very much. Before it comes over to you, let me perhaps remind you that Julia is with the microphone. If you do have a question, which we very much sincerely hope you do, please find my eye and we have a communication system. We'll get a microphone over to you. Good, I'm noting you, I'll come to you. And when the microphone does come, I'd be most grateful if you would give me your name and your designation so we know who we're speaking with. Just very briefly before we come onto the floor, looking back on comments from Una, how much more than Erasmus is coming up and free movement enriches a country. And one of the comments that you made, Una, we just do not know yet what we are going to lose with Brexit. Nicole mentioned civil society and Brexit, the importance of it. She also is very keen, I think still keen, if you have the answer to Brexit, either here in this room or online, please tell us. Tell us what it is. We'd be delighted, and then we'll go off and have a glass of wine, discuss it further. And Anthony, the free movement is vital, you say, and how can we in the future be part of programmes in the European Union? Now, this may be down to my journalistic shorthand, but I think you also said the European Union is not interested in an open marriage for a long time. Perhaps that's down to having a long transition period, and it may be shorter than some people may think. Over to you, and just up here in the back.
Hi there, Francesca Roberts, speaking from the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, though I have to admit I'm asking this in an external capacity, really. Professor Busby, you were talking about the EU withdrawal bill, and you mentioned some ways in which to influence that, which I think probably for a lot of people here, both as representatives of organisations, but also as individuals, how can you have an input into that? Thank you.
Well, it's at the House of Lords now. It's in committee stage. You can, the most direct way of doing it is to contact one of the members of the House of Lords at this stage, because we're quite late on in the process now, as you'll all be aware, and a lot of it's happened rather quickly. So there were opportunities earlier on when it was in the Commons, but what happens after it's been to the Lords is it ping-pong, so it goes back and forward between the two houses, and there then will be an opportunity to engage with parliamentarians in both places. But I think the easy answer to your question is contact a member of the House of Lords. There is information on this. If you speak to me, because I can't remember the name of the organisation who is directly engaged, but I can check it for you. I think there may be information on the Human Rights Consortium website as well, because what we did was we compiled a list of names of Lords who would be receptive to taking soundings, if you like, from organisations in the sort of voluntary sector, civil society sector. So I can give you information on that. But that's the most direct way to go at the moment because of the stage that it's at. And I think you want to make something quite specific. So organisations are already fed into the process, but if you've got a very specific thing that you think ought to be raised and hasn't been raised yet, I think that would be more helpful at this point. But if you come at the end, I can certainly give you the website address.
And just one thing, how long is it being, if there is a set time period, how long is it being discussed in the House of Lords?
I think Anthony might be clearer on this, because I think
Do you
it's...
have a duration?
There was meant to be 80 hours of debate scheduled, but I think they've had 1 day. So
They've had a day, yeah.
A day and a bit, so there are, I don't know how many days left there are, 9, 10?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. You can find it all on their website, I'm sure.
Yeah, it will be on the website. I think certainly when we get to Easter, there should be quite substantial development, I think, and which isn't very long away now. It's only another 4 weeks, and I think that so there's a very short window actually now, if you want to get involved in actually lobbying, if that's the right word.
A short window, but time to get engaged, and do take that up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. We have another question.
I'm Kevin Hutchins. I'm a board member from Langsdane Housing Association, and one of the subcommittees I sit on is the audit subcommittee. And my question relates to that. I mean, one of the things we have to monitor is our risk register. And there are many risks facing a housing association with over 2,000 properties. But one of them we have on the list is the implications of Brexit. What should we be looking at in assessing how high that should be in the risk register? And how regularly should we be monitoring that in, I think it was mentioned it's 40 weeks to go. Was it 40 weeks? Or was that different? Anyway, 400 days. 400 days. Sorry, 400 days. I'm actually putting it to 280 days, I realise. So 400 days to go. What should we be looking at, and how regularly should we actually be assessing that, or asking our internal auditors to do that?
Could you take that?
I guess it's for every organisation really to decide itself how high on the risk register the implications of Brexit are, and how much funding, if it's funding you're concerned about, you receive from the European Union, or which regulations you think might change. I think for an organisation like ours, we have it on our risk register, but we don't have it right at the very top, because there are, as you might imagine, for a voluntary organisation in this climate, there are other things there are other issues that are higher up in the risk register. But I think if you're an organisation that's regulated, then it should be pretty high in terms of the kinds of changes that both Nicole and Anthony mentioned in terms of regulation, that we just don't know whether it will change or whether there'll be appeals to legislation in this country. It's almost impossible to know.
Anthony.
Yes, so just with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer or anything, and there's no official advice, but in terms of, obviously, things that come to mind besides funding is costs, because the economic impact of Brexit is negative, then obviously there's that. Also immigration, so the rights of newly arrived EU citizens into the UK after the transition period or whatever else will have different rights to EU citizens who have successfully applied for some sort of settled status. And there might be implications, for instance, on their rights to live, right to work, right to be in the UK at all, even if, and so on. So there's that. And I just point out as well that, I mean, during the transition period, it's expected that most things should stay the same. So, for instance, the UK government originally said that it might want to have the opportunity to not apply new EU laws which come into effect during the transition period. And if it hasn't already caved in on that, I'm sure it will eventually. But after the transition is when you start to see the divergence between UK and Scottish law. You know, obviously some of this might be under Scottish law and EU law. So those are just some areas I could mention.
Thank you very much. Una.
Yeah, I just suddenly thought of something that is very high on our risk register, and that's the data protection regulation that's just about to hit us all in May. And that, I think, for any organisation that basically deals with human beings and their data, that should be incredibly high up. What measures you've already put in place to respond to the new regulations that are coming in.
Kevin, thank you very much for that. We have another question from the floor.
My name is Mark Mallon. I'm just a member of the public. I just want a wee quick question for each one, if you don't mind. Charles, do you think staying in Europe or leaving Europe, do you think it's going to affect the gender pay gap at the BBC? Anthony, are we actually a member of Schengen? Have we signed up to Schengen?
The UK is not in Schengen.
And Una, in terms of Ramness, I mean, why did the general public not know that they can take advantage of that? Why has it just been exclusive to things like university? And Nicole, if you could tell me, when you're talking about poverty, are you talking about the current poverty we have and education poverty we currently have in terms of attainment? Are you talking about health poverty that we currently have? Are you talking about housing poverty that we currently have? Is that going to change if we stay in Europe, or is there a chance? Because nobody says what the possibility of change for the better is. Is there a chance that in fact things might get better? Is that just a non-starter?
Martin, thank you very much. We'll take those along the table. Schengen, we're not in Schengen.
No, thanks. Thanks for the question. No, the UK is not in Schengen. Schengen area is the borderless travel zone, more or less, which is mainly subscribed to by most of the continental European member states, and also some countries which are in the European sort of Free Trade Association, so like Iceland and Norway and so on. So within this, once you enter the zone, you can travel without having to present, passport or travel documents and so on. Though I should say that as a result of situations like the migration crisis in the Mediterranean, some states have imposed temporary border restrictions to try and mitigate what they feel is an influx of people moving around. But that's not supposed to happen for more than a short period of time. So no, the UK and Ireland are part of a common travel area, which is presumably one of the reasons why Ireland didn't join Schengen to start. So that is why, just to conclude on that point, and obviously give time to the rest, is that the other two speakers, I should say, is that that's why the UK does have control over its own borders at the moment. As you probably be aware, is when you enter the UK, you have to go through passport control regardless of where you've come from, including where you've come from Europe. EU citizens are entitled to enter the UK in different circumstances to people from other nationalities, but the UK does have a border and it does maintain it. So a lot of the questions raised during the EU referendum were not based in fact.
Somewhat academic, but would Britain have been in a better place had it been a member of Schengen or not?
Well, I think that's hard to say, because it wouldn't necessarily. First of all, the UK is an island, so I mean that always. I was intrigued.
Had a better understanding of European Union.
No, because I mean EU citizens are entitled to enter the UK whether part of Schengen or not. It's just a question of whether or not you have to show a passport when you enter. It doesn't mean that it would have been easier or more difficult to enter the UK as an EU citizen, except you'd save a couple of seconds or longer if you're coming in through Heathrow, maybe. So no, I don't think so. In short,
quite a wee bit longer. Una, Erasmus.
Well, I guess before the coughing overtook me at the end of what I was saying, I was going to say that I didn't think we were necessarily leaving European civil society or the European voluntary sector, and largely the extension of Erasmus, the programme which was largely for university students being able to study in another European country, the Erasmus Plus programme is largely for young people. So it's not a general thing that any member of the public can take part in, but it is for all young people. And because of the kind of work that we do in Voluntary Matters and Voluntary, we focused on young people and young people with fewer opportunities. So, as I said, trying to use that Erasmus Plus programme to enlarge the views of young people in this country and in other European countries through allowing them to volunteer in other European countries and get that experience and get the kinds of skills that you possibly can get from volunteering, and the language skills that you can get from volunteering in another European country. So why it's not more generally known, I have no idea. But we've certainly tried in our organisation to spread the word about Erasmus Plus and the European Voluntary Service as far as we possibly can.
Hold on for the microphone, please.
Just for clarity on that, Anthony, you says that in fact that there's countries currently outside the European Union that are involved with Erasmus Plus in different Horizon 2020. So in fact, again, it's not necessarily an issue that we should be concerning ourselves with.
Well, only that I guess if we leave, and depending on the kinds of the kind of Brexit that we get, and the other two panellists are certainly more expert in that than I am, the government would have to. The UK government would just have to decide to pay into Erasmus Plus. So I think that's really the issue of continue to be in the programme. You make a contribution to it, as these other countries do, and it may be that they will. Well, that's what we're lobbying for them to continue to do that, so that we can continue the kind of work that we do.
Nico.
That's, I think maybe a misunderstanding. So when I mentioned the poverty and the impact of EU membership or non-membership on poverty, I wasn't making an assessment or an evaluation at all on that. What I was saying was that when we've spoken to organisations in the voluntary sector who work in support and advocacy services for individuals and communities in all of the contexts that you mentioned, actually, all the different types of poverty that you mentioned, it's something that they raised with us, saying it was a concern of theirs that their services would be affected by the UK's withdrawal from the EU. So just a point of clarification. And one other thing, actually, I've just got the name of the organisation. The question earlier about the House of Lords and influencing, which might be a benefit to all of you if you're interested in that. It's the Repeal Bill Alliance. You can Google them. They are neutral on membership or non-membership or withdrawal or non-withdrawal, but they are seeking to influence, and they've got loads of information about that. They came to the presentation to us, and it was very, very good. So Repeal Bill Alliance, if you want to get involved in the sort of lobbying, influencing of the legislation that's going through.
Thank you for that. Audrey, excuse me. Martin, I hope that's helped to answer your questions. I believe that one of the questions you also posed was, is leaving the EU going to help with the gender pay gap at the BBC? I couldn't link it to that. I'm not a member of the BBC, but I think I would happily say there should be no gender pay gap at all. Ladies and gentlemen, here in Glasgow, we have come to the end of our afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your company. I'd like to thank our panellists who've been with us today, and they are Una Aitken, Nicole Busby and Anthony Salomon. Thank you very much indeed for being here. I'd also like to say thanks to the European Parliament Liaison Office in Edinburgh and the team that we worked with there, Per Johansson, Helen Ross, Julia Piccionetti and Vivian Bateson. Thank you all very much indeed for your help. Advertising now, the 2nd of March, International Women's Day. There's an EP event in Edinburgh, and on May 9th there's a European Parliament event in Glasgow. Look to the website for further details on that. Thank you very much for joining us online. It's been a pleasure to have you. From Glasgow, good afternoon.